Well, we're going to start on time so that everybody gets a little time to get questions and answers. Good evening, everybody. This is the second plenary of the 4 days, but a very, very important one, gender and human rights. And it's wonderful to have gender as one of our plenary issues. So I want to begin by saying I'm Margaret Abraham, and good evening to everybody. It's truly a pleasure to be here. We have a wonderful panel this evening, and I'm going to introduce each of them just before their paper. What we want to do is wait for the questions and answers right to the end. Each speaker has about 18 minutes, and then after we finish, we'll open it up for question and answers. For many of us, today is a wonderful day for many reasons. Not only are we in Latin America, but we have a panel of really distinguished feminist scholars, people who have done amazing work in gender and human rights, and many other issues, as you will hear tonight. But most importantly, as you will see, and it's kind of funny, everybody decided that unlike those podiums that look a little hard and standing here, we're all going to sit in solidarity and have our presentations from here, or their presentations from here. So our first speaker today is Dr. Dora Barrancos. And Dr. Dora Barrancos is from the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research. Dora holds a PhD in history from UNICAMP and a Master of Education. She is a researcher of the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research and professor of Latin American Social History in the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Buenos Aires. She coordinates the master's program in Social and Cultural Studies, Humanities Faculty, National University of La Pampa, and is the director of the Interdisciplinary Institute of Gender Studies. Professor Barrancos is the author of numerous books and articles which focuses on themes such as women and culture, the childcare, social movements in history, the presence of women in the social struggles, as well as methodological and epistemological aspects. There's much to Dora's CV, as you know, to all the three panelists here, but I think you really want to hear their papers rather than a major introduction. So Dora, a pleasure to have you.
Muchísimas gracias a toda la organización de este segundo fórum de la Asociación Internacional de Sociología, que es mi profesión de base. Agradezco muchísimo la perspectiva de este panel, especialmente a nuestra querida Margaret Graham, que ha tenido la cariñosa iniciativa de invitarme a participar con estas distinguidísimas colegas. Creo que este sí que es un panel multicultural. Mi comunicación tiene que ver con un análisis, un balance de los estudios de género y la renovación de las ciencias sociales en la Argentina. El informe producido ya hace bastante más de una década por un grupo de notables, entre quienes estaban Fox-Keller, a solicitud de la Fundación Gulbenkian de Portugal, y cuya coordinación estuvo a cargo de Immanuel Wallerstein, hizo recomendaciones de gran significado para renovar la enseñanza de las ciencias sociales. En verdad, el informe se expedía sobre el escaso reflejo que tenía, sobre todo en la formación de grado, la vigorosa renovación del conocimiento en las diversas disciplinas concernientes a nuestras ciencias. Una cuestión pendiente a introducir en la formación universitaria era justamente la dimensión de género, La transformación de las aristas epistemológicas que promovía tanto como las inconmensurables oportunidades de conocimiento que aportaban los interrogantes de la perspectiva de género, se auguraban promisorias para la nueva educación universitaria. Y aunque en nuestro país hay un importantísimo reconocimiento a Immanuel Wallerstein, se está lejos, muy lejos, de cumplir con las sugerencias del informe que coordinó, ya que los planes de estudio revelan innegable anquilosamiento, entre otras circunstancias, por el escaso lugar para los estudios de género en la currícula de grado. Pero no podría decirse lo mismo con respecto a la investigación académica. En efecto, todas las disciplinas sociales y humanísticas, incluiré obviamente las humanidades dentro del grupo de las sociales, ha aumentado de modo significativo el número de investigaciones que les son atinentes. Sin duda estamos frente a por lo menos 4 fenómenos que analizaré lo más rápido que sea posible. En primer lugar, el impacto de las demandas locales por la conquista de los derechos femeninos y de las personas con disímil identidad sexual. 2. El ímpetu del desarrollo internacional de los estudios dedicados a las relaciones de género y a las sexualidades disidentes. 3. El desarrollo del sistema de posgraduación en las ciencias sociales y el incremento de la financiación de estudios de posgrados. 4. La creciente aceptación por parte del sistema científico nacional relativa a las investigaciones conceptualmente renovadas. Voy a ser muy sucinta porque el tiempo corre. En primer lugar, el impacto del feminismo y las agencias por derecho de la identidad sexual disidente. La Argentina, como es bien sabido, reingresó al Estado de Derecho a fines de 1983. La nueva situación permitió que se reavivara el debate sobre la diferencia sexual jerarquizada y la oclusión de los derechos femeninos. No pocos grupos de mujeres asomaron en el escenario nacional solicitando como una cuestión decisiva en la nueva era democrática reconquistada el reconocimiento de los derechos que no se equipararan a los varones. También contó el regreso del exilio de numerosas mujeres que tomaron contacto con el movimiento feminista, de modo que en pocos años nuestro país transitó una serie de modificaciones importantes en materia de derechos. Una de ellas, el balance va a ser muy rápido, es la Ley de Cupo Femenino en 1991. Es un país pionero, la Argentina, que asegura al menos el 30% de candidaturas mujeres en los cargos de representación popular. Desde 1984 hasta el presente hay una serie de derechos formales que hemos ganado. Uno de ellos, y muy importante, es la patria potestad compartida, el divorcio vincular, que era una vieja deuda de la Argentina moderna. Y yo creo que una de las cuestiones más importantes es el haber incorporado a la Constitución reformada de 1994 nada menos que la CEDAW, esto es la Declaración contra todas las formas de discriminación de las mujeres, y hasta donde he visto, la Argentina es el único país en América Latina que incorpora taxativamente en el plexo constitucional nada menos que esa convención. El resto de los países lo hace de manera, yo diría, hay que inferir que se trata de la convención. Las ciencias sociales no pudieron ausentarse del régimen de significación traído entonces por la agencia feminista y el movimiento más amplio de mujeres. Voy a recordar que desde 1985 se asiste en la Argentina a una circunstancia que es también excepcional, el Encuentro Nacional de Mujeres, circunstancia que digo es completamente original año tras año y no quiere decir que las miles de mujeres que se reúnen sean todas feministas, por supuesto. A inicios del 90, un grupo de universidades nacionales ya exhibía áreas, centros o programas destinados a los estudios de las mujeres. Voy a recordar que una iniciativa había sido desarrollada en la Facultad de Psicología de esta universidad, donde se había desarrollado una diplomatura específica, pero lo cierto es que fueron lentamente ingresando a las universidades los estudios de género. Recordaré que en 1991 tuvimos la primera jornada de estudios de las mujeres en nuestro país y a partir de ahí hay una extraordinaria tradición mantenida en esta reunión cada 2 años con una notable modificación del perfil de las comunicaciones. En 1991 era apenas un pequeño puñado de comunicaciones. En las últimas jornadas realizadas en la Universidad de Luján hubo más de 600 comunicaciones y si en la primera el 54% correspondía a historia de las mujeres, en el encuentro de 2010 23% correspondió a historia de las mujeres, 20% a literatura, 11% a sociología, 8% a educación, etc. No hay dudas de que la otra agencia de gran significado con repercusiones sobre la investigación en nuestras disciplinas fue la desarrollada por las organizaciones que congregaban a personas gays y lesbianas. Si bien los primeros nucleamientos en torno a derechos remiten a la década de 1970, hubo que esperar la terminación de la feroz dictadura para que, sobre todo a raíz de la epidemia de SIDA, lo que posibilitó el empinamiento de sus acciones reivindicativas, tal como nos lo ha mostrado un gran sociólogo argentino, Ernesto Mejía. El Estado fue conmovido por la necesidad de dar visibilidad al fenómeno de la homosexualidad y de realizar intervenciones para facilitar las circunstancias de su salud, aunque no faltaron tensiones y crisis entre los diferentes grupos de estas agencias. La saga por derechos se amplió considerablemente en la sociedad argentina y entonces las ciencias sociales debieron responder a las interpelaciones de esos nuevos actores movilizados. En el espectro de los denominados nuevos movimientos sociales, la sexualidad disidente acicateó en torno de un nuevo estado de conocimiento, horizonte que se amplió en la segunda mitad de los 90 con las demandas mucho más activas realizadas también por travestis, transexuales y transgéneros. Los estudios queer se iniciaron a la sombra de la academia, con limitado reconocimiento, pero fueron ganando acogida y yo diría que a medida que se avanzó en los 90, a fines de los 90, hubo un entonces mayor reconocimiento en nuestras universidades de estas investigaciones. En suma, tal como había ocurrido con los estudios referidos a las mujeres, fueron las demandas de reconocimiento de quienes estaban afectados por su sexualidad disidente, quienes impulsaron las investigaciones renovadoras en nuestras unidades académicas. 2. El impulso de la crítica feminista y queer en la arena internacional. Frente a la renovación de los puntos de vista que señalan la dependencia de nuestras disciplinas sociales latinoamericanas de fuentes norteamericanas o eurocéntricas, me permito discutir en parte el significado de esa articulación entrañable y aunque estoy lejos de negar por completo esa circunstancia, mi perspectiva matiza las objeciones que se han planteado. No hay cómo negar que las ciencias sociales en América Latina se hallaron bajo la influencia del estructural funcionalismo, pero entre las reacciones más notables habidas justamente en los 60, aparece, por supuesto que en consonancia con otros autores que no son latinoamericanos, la teoría de la dependencia, y recordaré a Furtado, Cardoso y Faleto. Se incorporó la crítica francesa en nuestros medios. Voy a recordar el impacto que tuvieron Althusser, Balibar, Coulantzas, para no citar el notable aliento que emanaba de la figura más destacada en materia de contundente formulación engagée, el filósofo Jean-Paul Sartre. No puede dejar de estimarse la irrupción del pensamiento de Antonio Gramsci, sobre todo en nuestro país, una recepción que permite ser comparada, porque es así, con la de Michel Foucault en la escena brasileña en los años 65 e inicios de la década del 70. De modo que cierta desterrada del análisis positivo funcionalista que estandarizaba las fórmulas más colonizadas de nuestro pensamiento, dio lugar a la recepción de autores europeos que fueron apropiados, para no citar los norteamericanos, Wright Mills, por ejemplo, y su impacto en nuestro país, en orden a aguzar las tesis de la radicalidad política. Es necesario recordar que la crítica radicalizada de la época llegó a todas las instituciones. Basta recordar la teoría de la reproducción, de Bourdieu y Passeron, las argumentaciones ilegitimantes de la familia, recuerdo a Cooper en los años 70, y las tesis acerca del fin de los manicomios con Basaglia, un famoso líder italiano en los años 60. Por supuesto que más recientemente los estudios postcoloniales han vuelto a sacudir con una nueva impugnación acerca de las fuerzas externas, sobre todo eurocéntricas, que de alguna manera tienen gran atribución en nuestra perspectiva sociológica. Sin embargo, permítaseme sostener la enorme contribución que ha realizado la crítica feminista internacional. Y no voy a citar países ni figuras relevantes. Sus producciones constituyen un acicate tanto para las reconversiones políticas vividas por las militantes feministas bajo procesos autoritarios y posautoritarios como epistemológicos, y fueron auxiliares decisivos, inclusive para la posibilidad de caminos teóricos más consonantes con nuestras realidades sociales. El propio feminismo de las casas matrices fue alterado profundamente cuando cundieron las reacciones de las que se sentían con justicia silenciadas por el propio universalismo sujetador de las mujeres WASP. Discuto entonces que la incorporación de ese gran legado crítico propuesto por el feminismo de los 70, que promovió rupturas conmovedoras para asegurar procesos libertarios y de igualación entre todos los conjuntos femeninos, haya significado solo construcciones alienígenas en los cauces de nuestro feminismo. Mencionaré apenas a esa gran chilena, a Julieta Kirkwood, la investigadora, en palabras de una gran crítica chilena, Nelly Rillard, la investigadora más creativa del feminismo latinoamericana de los 80, que no se sustrajo a las referencias del feminismo internacional, sin renunciar a sus claves más transversales, sin embargo, empleó una voz local y situada, en sintonía con la condición de las congéneres más excluidas. Recordaré su abogacía para que las mujeres de las fuerzas más democráticas chilenas comprendieran que había una causa específica en tanto mujeres, de la misma manera que había un desafío para conquistar la igualdad de género junto con la distribución equitativa de la riqueza. No puedo soslayar el impacto de las indagaciones queer, en particular de las que provinieron del área norteamericana. Me animo a hipotetizar sobre la estimulación que significaron trabajos como los de Judith Butler, por citar solo una de las más conocidas, para la propia militancia, el espaldarazo que recibieron ambos derroteros, la acción política y la indagación académica en los últimos 15 años en la mayoría de nuestros países. Creo que más allá de las evidencias de la colonialidad del poder, en palabras de Quijano, que está participando de este gran congreso, y de las formaciones epistemológicas provenientes de concepciones feministas hegemonizadas por percepciones, sentimientos y representaciones de mujeres blancas de clase media, heterosexuales, el tembladeral que caracteriza a la propia crítica feminista arroja, creo, el sentido de una permanente revocación de cualquier estatuto dominante. Sostengo que en pocas áreas del conocimiento se convoca tanto al vínculo inescindible entre lo político y lo académico como ocurre con los estudios de mujeres, y de muy diversas manifestaciones bajo cualquier condición, tal vez siguiendo el clarividente postulado de Virginia Woolf: como soy una mujer, mi patria es el mundo. Finalmente, como Margaret me señala que tengo solo 3 minutos, es increíble, voy a decir solo 2 cuestiones. Nuestro país asiste a un desarrollo notable del sistema de asistencia con becas postdoctorales. Ha habido un crecimiento exponencial tanto de la matrícula de posgrado en la Argentina. Tenemos hoy que el 57% del alumnado de posgrado en las universidades públicas corresponde a las ciencias sociales y humanas. Es evidente que nosotros tenemos en este momento una capacidad para asistir con más becas, aunque siempre serán escasas, los estudios de postdoctorado. Hacia el 2001 había 2.500 becas y hoy día el CONICET, el órgano del cual participo, está sosteniendo 8.000 becas y llegaremos el próximo año, eso espero, a 9.300 becas. Por último, hay sin duda una apertura del sistema científico. Voy a recordar que alrededor de los nuevos 100 ingresantes al CONICET, que hegemoniza la investigación científica y tecnológica en nuestro país, de los 114 ingresantes en el 2011 en el área de sociología y demografía, con diversos proyectos de investigación, 18 de ellos estuvieron vinculados a algún problema relacionados con las mujeres, con las relaciones de géneros y las sexualidades, alcanzando entonces una proporción de 16%, que es para nosotros extraordinaria si miramos lo que ocurría 10, 12 años atrás. Finalmente, sin duda, esta labor ha ido mucho más lejos que nuestra capacidad de actualizar la currícula universitaria. Salvo en experiencia de formación en posgrado, la currícula universitaria requiere de enormes transformaciones en el sentido que vengo diciendo. Las conversaciones de nuestros análisis son eclécticas, fundadas en la necesidad de desentrañar con diferentes enfoques teóricos y metodológicos muy diversos ángulos de observación. Las operaciones interdisciplinarias emergen de la poliédrica manifestación de los sujetos y sus circunstancias, un plegamiento a las evidencias de las racionalidades múltiples, en términos de mi admirado Gilles Deleuze, un acatamiento en todo caso, a los intrincados fenómenos que ofrece el movimiento perpetuo de las identidades. Gracias.
Dora Barrancos, thank you very much. I just want to make an announcement. Professor Barrancos, thank you very much for that illuminating talk. I just want to mention to people who may not have, as we have simultaneous translation, if you don't have it, because yesterday I heard some people didn't realize that there were, you had the opportunity to get it, please do go and avail of that if you need to. I also want to take a moment to recognize, before we go to the next talk, Professor Alicia Palermo, who has also been of the local organizing community and an important part when we talk about feminist scholarship. So, Alicia, just at least stand up for a second so some of the people can see you. Our second speaker today is Patricia McFADDEN, extraordinary visiting professor in women's studies at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. Professor McFADDEN is extraordinary visiting professor at the Women and Gender Studies Department at the University of Western Cape. She's an African feminist scholar, activist, who lives and works on the African continent and in the Global Academy. She currently resides in both Zimbabwe and Swaziland, and her work ranges across a variety of critical feminist issues: sexuality, citizenship, and post-coloniality, nationalism, and revolutionary struggles, and the writing as resistance on the African continent. She has published in various journals and anthologies, edited a feminist journal, Safari, and several texts, and worked as a consultant with the UN, Ford Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. Her latest publications include Challenges for African Feminism in the Contemporary Movement, in Harvesting Feminist Knowledge for Public Policy Rebuilding Progress, Exceptionalism is a Feminist Issue in Southern Africa, in African Women, a Political Economy. Okay, sorry. Professor McFADDEN has an amazing resume, like everybody on this panel, but also, you know, as many feminist scholars do, and many of us, we all have, outside of the world of academia, do other things, and she's a vegan, and she grows her own vegetables, and I said I had to say that as that was a part of her history, and I know some of you feel quite seriously about that, Patricia. The title of her paper is Contesting Gender and Human Rights Entitlement in Southern Africa, Contemporary Feminist Struggles.
Thank you, Margaret, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. It was a long flight. Okay.
We all
Thanks. It was a long flight, and at one point I wondered if it was, you know, worth 2 days of flying. But after 3 days in Buenos Aires, I know I made the right decision. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been absolutely wonderful. And listening to the sessions, I have felt a certain solidarity and familiarity, excuse me, with the issues. And I hope that my presentation this afternoon or evening will interface and reinforce or extend critical thinking as well as celebrations of resistance and the search for freedom, which is, I think, what brings us to this place. We're looking for ways of changing our worlds so that we all can live lives of dignity in new and different ways. So the main point of my paper, and I apologize to the translators because I'm transgressing a little bit, but the main point of my paper is really to argue that we have to disembed rights. Human rights as a large category and all the different elements that compose it, including, of course, and particularly women's rights, we have to disembed them from capitalism. We have to remove them from the prison of the market. And we have to redefine them as rights rather than our entitlements being tied to profit and to wealth and to privilege. So basically, that's what my paper is about. I'm going to try to contextualize this argument within Southern Africa because we do have to learn to respect time in many, many ways. So I'm going to read. Southern Africa, which is the region that I will be referring to consistently in my paper, has acquired a distinctive historical and contemporary character as a region that experienced what is referred to as a special type of colonialism. This is political economy speak for the practice of exceptionalism. As a consequence, particularly within South Africa, the pervasiveness of capitalist relations of production and exploitation led to the presence of well-developed tensions between, on the one hand, ideological discourses that have underpinned 4 centuries of a market-driven, raced society, which remains essentially white and extremely privileged, and on the other hand, large swathes of human beings whose worth in aesthetic and physical terms continues to be measured by whether they are located within systems of profit-making production, the so-called job, or are languishing in the sprawling reservoirs of cheap labor known as rural areas and townships. And what's interesting is that these reservoirs have now become the focus of a new aspect of tourism, where people can go and look at how the economically and socially and politically excluded majorities in countries like South Africa, how they live. And it's an exotic experience. It's a new industry. It's a way of mining exclusion and finding new ways to extend the profit margins. South Africa has an exceptionally high percentage of unemployed youth, a demographic that is common across the continent. And becoming a member of BRICS has only exacerbated and further exposed the underlying crises of social reproduction and expectation among the Black majority. What characterizes South Africa as an exceptional society on the continent, racial, social, and cultural heterogeneity, and seemingly unfathomable divides, resonates with familiarity across Southern Africa, albeit in milder forms. The region is very similar in many ways, and that is why the resistance to apartheid encompassed almost all the societies of the region. It is in this market-defined context that the proposition is made that rights are inalienable endowments which all humans inherit equally on their entry into society, side by side with the practices of exploitation and the commodification of certain human beings. And in Southern Africa, it is African people. It is in this context that the irreconcilable contradiction between struggles for lives of dignity for all exists with the seemingly unstoppable inevitability of profit-making, so-called entrepreneurship, and this is where they collide. On the one hand, there is a clear and historically grounded expectation that everyone in the region, and in South Africa especially, having only recently arrived at the neo-colonial moment, that everyone will eventually have access to all rights, whether they are articulated within UN-crafted instruments, which my colleague here referred to, or whether they are demanded by NGOs representing specific interest groups, and women, of course, are a large element of that. This is one part of the conundrum. While those in the state and at the helm of large globalized economic organizations, banks, mining companies, financial conglomerates, technology industries, etc., proceed with business as usual, mouthing the neoliberal platitudes of democratic inclusiveness, even as the social and economic fissures tear the societies asunder. The angry and frustrated crowds of working people demanding a living wage, and this is the 21st century, and millions, hundreds of millions of people in the world are still having to go out on the street to demand a living wage. And we have trillionaires in the world. I mean, how gross does it get? So the angry and frustrated crowds of working people demanding a living wage on the streets of the various capitals of the region speak dramatically to the active contestations that mirror difference in terms of traditional forms of privilege, as well as the more contemporary expressions of resistance against newer forms of social exclusion. The struggle for all rights marks these social outcomes with the insignia of resistance as the energy of life, the desire and determination to change one's world as people who are situated outside the progress that all humans contribute to, reach for their futures as these people reach for their futures. Workers, excluded communities made up largely of women and their families, LGBTQ communities, and those living with the challenges of disability all shape the meanings and aspirations that encompass the notion of rights. However, the distance between the ideas that have become so popular and common sense and the realization of even the most basic social rights for everyone continues to grow as globalized capital widens the gap between and among groups of people everywhere. And we see in Southern Africa that there are tremendous struggles around land. And many of these struggles resonate across the world. We know that the main reservoir of private property is in land. We know that people crossed oceans, took tremendous risks for land. And so the struggle to reclaim land, to reclaim futures, is raging in Southern Africa. The declaration of rainbow nations and truth and reconciliation commissions, and these are mere purges of what is not going to go away unless people actually have access to the most basic resources in their own societies. While gendered contestations remain central to all the demands that working people are making against those who control the state and the vast resources of the region, given that women are not only numerically in the majority, that they bear tremendous burdens of social reproduction, regardless of where they are located geographically and structurally, and given that women's organizations have been actively mobilizing and engaging the state for several decades at the local, continental, and international levels, nonetheless, the notion of rights in conceptual and other terms remains largely unproblematized in relation to capitalism and neoliberalism, and the neocolonial state as a site of power and plunder. And we need to do this. We need to problematize the relationship between the idea of rights and a discourse about the state. Often in Africa, what happens is that this discourse, this conversation, is truncated by the application of a peculiar notion that there's something called the African state. You know, and you have texts replete with this mythology about there being a very particular type of state in Africa. You know, that it is a corrupt state, it is a failed state, and all these adjectives, these attachments to the state cloud and confuse our understandings of the state. The phenomenon of the state is a historical process that emerges when certain factors exist, certain conditions exist in all societies. The fact that there are states in Africa, or that there is a class-based state in Africa, is, I think, the most important starting point. But we do need to actually conceptually reclaim the state and have the conversation of what the relationship is between the idea of rights and the phenomenon of the state. I lost my spot. Yes, I will find it. This disjuncture, this conceptual disjuncture, leaves the current definition and understanding of rights swinging in the wind, because it's untethered to the critical elements of entitlement as consciousness in a very, very critical moment on our continent of transition to post-colonial futures in the region and generally across the societies of the South. In Africa, struggles for rights as gendered, raced, cultured, sexualized, and embodied entitlements are deeply embedded in the traditions of anti-colonial resistance, articulated through nationalist visions and practices of resistance. Until recently, rights were conceived of as adequately encompassed by the notion of political independence. And it was generally assumed that providing the bare necessities of survival, like a minimal educational infrastructure, poor housing and unreliable transportation, and the maintenance of widespread casualized labor practices would be enough to keep the working people satisfied. However, this has not been the case. Over the past half-century, women's struggles in both the public and private arenas of their respective societies have expanded the ideas that inform the notion of rights, thereby visibilizing the inadequacies of nationalism as an overarching ideological framework which proclaimed the inclusion of all genders, even as it systematically privileged males of all classes and ages. Gendering rights as a political shift in the political, sociocultural, and sexual landscapes of our societies has also elicited a deep backlash that has affected not only the ways in which women who struggle for different lives respond, but it has also reinforced the forces driving neoliberalism and neocolonial state and class consolidation. Am I still within my...
Yes.
Yes, thank you. At a general level, the resistance to an acceptance that patriarchal privilege lies at the heart of all the blatant and/or covert forms of repression and rights denial which characterize all our society has not only enabled man to continue to control and enjoy private and public expressions of privilege and power, but it has also re-entrenched the very means by which women are hemmed in and corralled through cultural surveillance and widespread impunity. Through a systematic coordination of various right-wing agendas, religious, Christian fundamentalisms, nationalist cultural reinventions of tradition, and feudal practices that are blatantly misogynist and conservative, and through the vilification of feminist ideas and the very reference to radical politics for women and people generally, most of the spaces for alternative debate and conversation have been eliminated from our social milieus. Newspapers and numerous forms of media that proliferate across class and other divides create a sensibility of equalness which is unrelated to the notions of equality and fairness that are foundational to struggles for rights. More directly, the failure of women's movements to use contestation as a critical thinking and activist lever in establishing the conceptual link between the futility of rights as reforms and the hegemonic dominance of neoliberal capitalism universally has resulted in a political and activist stalemate, exposing the various flaws of nationalism as an ideology of struggle for gendered rights in particular. By actively contesting the presumptions that alternative social and political discourses and sites are not necessary, that one just has to work hard and success will be assured, a myth that is widespread in a country like that of South Africa, despite its 4-century-old history of structural and socio-economic, legal, and political exclusion. Feminists, when we challenge this, we re-enter the moment of political creativity publicly and in our private lives, but we also realize that such engagement with radical ideas and possibilities opens up critical spaces for new thinking and a re-examination of the contemporary context within which African feminists are located. So, while some gains seemed to have been made across the continent in the first few decades of independence through women's mobilization and engagement with the neo-colonial state, the resurgence of neoliberalism in Southern Africa has resulted in a severe attrition of declared rights, located mainly in heavily contested constitutions in all our societies. And during the question time, if somebody would like to know what I mean, I have 2 examples that I would like to share with you. For rights to function on behalf of working people throughout a society, the gap between declared inclusion and protections and the reality of people's daily lived experiences has to be closed through a disembedding of rights as privileges that are tied to the market and to profit-making economic systems. Rights have to be resituated within a lively, socially driven agenda and vision that is nurtured by a dedication to fairness in the redistribution of social and material resources as part of the protection of our worlds and the ecological systems that serve as our lifelines, through new applications of the technological revolution that will benefit all people in their respective societies without the war and the destruction that has accompanied the emergence of this technological revolution, and through a courageous critique and rejection of all forms of privilege. These are the key challenges that lie at the heart of a contemporary African feminism, which must form a central part of the vision of a different and more inclusive post-colonial African future. Thank you.